Here's a segment from a recent Gun Talk radio episode. You can listen to all the Gun Talk radio podcasts however you tune in, or check out guntalk.com for more. What happens when an experienced law enforcement officer simply calls BS to Joe Biden's gun control, gun ban schemes? Interesting question. Well, Sarasota County Sheriff Kurt Hoffman did exactly that. He talked about it, then he penned a piece about it, and he just said no. He said, this just doesn't make sense. He joins us right now. Sheriff Hoffman, welcome to Gun Talk.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tom. I appreciate it.
You bet. In our correspondence, we found out that we have traveled kind of similar paths, both hanging around airplanes and guns and stuff like that for a long time.
We have, and we both had good fathers who raised us right, put a shotgun in our hand. And, I know my father sure enjoyed reading all the articles that your dad put in Sports Field, and he laid a few of them on in my bedroom when I was a teenager, and I read them as well. So, yes, we have traveled similar paths, and I think we're better for it, Tom.
Well, let me ask you, you've got an interesting background, a lot of experience in law enforcement, been a prosecutor, lawyer, and obviously a law enforcement officer and sheriff now, the high sheriff, if you will. And interestingly enough, in Florida, which really was the state that kind of started the whole concealed carry movement some 25, 35 years ago, where everybody said blood would run in the streets, and they called it, it's not going to be the Sunshine State anymore, it's going to be the Gunshine State. So you have actually seen the predictions of mayhem not come true over the years, correct?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm starting my 33rd year in law enforcement. And as a law enforcement manager, and as you mentioned, 8 years as a prosecutor, and frankly, the opposite has happened. If you have elected officials, particularly sheriffs, that are willing to go after criminals, which is what we did here in Sarasota County, we looked at who are the worst of the worst offenders in our county. As we all know, those offenders account for the majority of your crime in your community. So once you target them and remove them, and let our citizens exercise their Second Amendment rights, you have a very safe community, which is what we have right now. So I've not seen it turn into the Gunshine State. It is actually a very safe community that we live in. We have a very proactive governor and state legislature right now, and it's a good place to live, Tom.
I don't know if the numbers are exactly right, but my sense is something like 10% of the criminals are committing 80 to 90% of the crimes, certainly the serious crimes. Does that gel with your experience?
Sure, you're pretty close. When we identified our top criminals through a metric that we had, it was about 8% of them that were causing us the majority of crimes. We had one individual who was a serial armed burglar, and he was out of our jail for 67 minutes after he bonded out before he was breaking into somebody's house again. So those kind of people can really wreak havoc on your community, and it's where the sheriffs and, frankly, where the police chiefs, who are a little behind, in my opinion, should be focusing, not on folks who are lawfully possessing firearms and exercising their Second Amendment rights.
You mean it really is as simple as these people commit crimes over and over and over again. So if they're not out there doing that, you actually can reduce the crime.
You can, and we have, in our last quarter for 2020 is now in on our website, and it's dropped even lower, and my goal is to drop it even lower in 2021 by focusing on those folks. I don't pay much attention to this, as you mentioned from your intro there, the stuff that Biden's talking about, because at the end of the day, sheriffs like myself are the ones that are going to have to either pair up or not pair up with federal agents to enforce any of this stuff. And, I can speak for myself. I don't intend to do that. In fact, I'm pushing our state legislature to kind of follow Montana's lead. If you recently saw that they're going to make it unlawful for local government officials to cooperate with the federal government in the implementation of that. Now, you can't stop them, but you can certainly prevent local jurisdictions from assisting them in unconstitutional weapon grabs and gun registration.
With your background in law enforcement, you've been dealing with the bad guys for a long, long time. I have this theory, and I'd like to run it past you, and that is that those of us who don't deal with the bad guys like you do, really don't have a realistic appreciation of how bad some of the bad guys really are. Is that fair?
It is fair. So just to give you an example, Tom, I had a press conference on Friday. I had a homicide here in our county, and that individual had been arrested 35 times, 19 convictions as a felon, about a dozen misdemeanor convictions. Recently got out of prison on a jail sentence that he did there. And that kind of person, in this particular case, took somebody's life. And if you look at the trail of his criminal history, not just in my county, but in other parts of the state of Florida where he's lived, he's just been a one-person wrecking machine on civility in our communities.
Amazing. In this piece that you wrote, you're kind of directly addressing Joe Biden's proposed executive actions and the things he wants to do. And you're just calling BS to it, just saying, look, rather than doing that, how about stop doing the whole defund the police nonsense?
Well, there's so many things wrong about that. I mean, first of all, I think the fact that he thinks that he can legislate some of that from the White House, and we know, and I know you spoke on some of your other shows about what he can and can't do, but obviously he's setting the national narrative, and I don't know if he gives a hoot about some little old sheriff down here in Sarasota County, but I need my citizens to know, because I'm asked this question often. I mean, on a weekly basis, what are you as our sheriff going to do when the federal government comes in and starts to try to, if you look at Feinstein's bill or you look at Sheila Jackson Lee's bill, some of that stuff is, the liberals never wanted to talk about gun registration. That was their end result, right? Well, they're talking about it now. They're basically, in Feinstein's bill, she says, if you can grandfather your guns in, well, how do you grandfather those in and the government know what you have if you don't have to register those at that time? So all pretense is falling away, and this is, a gun grab and gun registration. And then, of course, you throw David Chipman up there, and as an affront to all of us who enjoy our Second Amendment rights, the guy who, calls things like assault weapons and weapons of war and uses that silly terminology, ghost guns, wanting to make owning a block of aluminum illegal.
Yeah, talking about David Chipman, who's been nominated to head the ATF. He's the one that said that the Second Amendment envisioned firearms as being well regulated. And anybody who can read knows the Second Amendment doesn't say that firearms would be well regulated. It said the militia would be. And we know that the militia, being well regulated, meant that they were well armed and well practiced.
Right, and we know that the militia is us, right, the people, and number one. And number two, I'm a little bit of a student of history, and I taught constitutional law on the side as an adjunct law professor when I was a prosecutor. If you go back and look at that well-regulated militia language, particularly in James Madison's writing, what he's talking about is well-equipped, well-trained, ready to go. The exact opposite of what David Chipman is saying. He's saying we need as citizens to be prepared and to have our firearms and be well-equipped. That's what he meant by well-regulated. It's clear in his writing. So that's just taking the words out of the historical context, and I just don't think David Chipman is particularly a student of history to even know that that's what the purpose was.
I love when you point out if Biden's concerned with gun trafficking, maybe you ought to take a look at his administration with Obama, where they were running thousands of guns to the narco-terrorists down in Mexico under the Fast and Furious program.
Yes, and got a federal agent killed. And obviously under the dictionary definition of hypocrisy, that must be it, Tom, because he put that right at the top of the list of things that he wants to do. And that administration was probably guilty of one of the largest gun trafficking schemes to go south of the border and get people killed. So all of that is, frankly, hypocrisy in my opinion. I'm asked all the time about ghost guns, and I don't even like using that term. I'll use it so we all know what we're talking about. But in 30 some odd years, and obviously Americans have been building guns for 240 or 50 years, I've never confiscated a ghost gun used in a crime. Now, I know some of these cities will tell you, Washington, D.C., Chicago, you can't believe anything that's coming out of those jurisdictions anyway because they're controlled primarily by Democrats and liberals, and they create the narrative. But I don't have one in my evidence locker right now, Tom, so I'm not sure what they're talking about there.
Wow. Did you get any pushback from this piece where you said basically you just called BS on Biden?
So there's some local radio stations here that have 4 or 5 listeners that I did catch part of one. One of my pro Second Amendment buddies and a really good county commissioner here in Sarasota County told me to tune in, and I did. And the discussion was that they were going to be watching Kurt Hoffman and make sure that he lived up to his campaign promises. Well, anybody that wants to go back and look at my campaign brochure, they'll see the Second Amendment on the front of the brochure. So I'm checking that box right now on your show, Tom. So I'm on track with what I told him I would do.
That is terrific. So let's see. Florida does not, I don't believe you have constitutional carry yet, right?
No, we're not. And I'm trying to get my fellow sheriffs to get behind that. We had 2 or 3 pieces of legislation as an association that we wanted to get through this year. We had a very big loophole with sex offenders, and we wanted to close that loophole. But next year, we've got to work on constitutional carry. And for your listeners, Tom, we have a agriculture commissioner here in Florida who is a Democrat, the only statewide elected Democrat that we have. And she's put up every roadblock she possibly can to my citizens being able to get their CCW. And to me, that is an infringement on our Second Amendment rights. When COVID hit, she basically closed up shop and didn't process those. I was still processing fingerprints out of my office to make sure that they didn't back up. So constitutional carry will remove the impediments that these bureaucrats can put in front of our citizens to be able to have their firearms. And as you've said many times, we shouldn't have to ask permission to exercise our constitutional rights.
There it is. Sarasota County Sheriff Kurt Hoffman. Kurt, thank you so much for your time and for what you're doing there. And I'm telling you, we just appreciate it. I know there are a lot of people who are thinking, man, I wish you were my sheriff.
Well, I appreciate it, Tom, and I appreciate all your listeners, and keep the faith out there. We're going to take the House back in the midterms, and we'll get our constitutional rights back. Thanks, Tom.
All right, you take care.